Hi, everybody, and welcome back to our Bible study in the book of Job. We are in Job chapter 3 today. You can download this PDF on our website for free if you would like it. It has all the key information on it at tobelikechrist.com. There is a link down in the description. Let's return to our short outline of the book of Job. This is going to be relevant today because we've passed through the first section and now we're on to the second section, which is really the bulk of this book. So in chapters 1 through 2, we talked about Job's persecution by Satan. Now we're going to begin talking about Job and his friends discussing the reasons for his sufferings. And the language today is going to, well, I'll get into that at the beginning of our outline, I guess. Let's proceed with our breakdown of Job here. We are going to travel all the way through 37, covering these discussions between Job and his friends. And then in 38 through 41, God is actually going to speak with Job directly. And then in chapter 42, God is going to restore what Job lost in his persecution. Now let's go down to our key figures, our key characters section. First, we have Job, who is the main character. He is a righteous man, an upright man who's blameless before God, and Satan is trying to turn his heart away from God by persecuting him and making his life hard, get him to abandon his faith. Now, our second character, if you could say that, is not actually a human. It's a creature. And I have to admit that as a child, Job interested me mostly because of the discussion around this creature and the behemoth, if you have read about that later on in Job. This creature was known as the Leviathan and is mentioned here, and it will be mentioned later on in the chapter. The Leviathan was a mighty creature, likely now extinct, described in detail in Job 41 and also mentioned in Psalm 74, if you remember that. It was a powerful scaled creature that was untamable by men and unkillable with human weapons. Some scholars suggest that this is a reference to a crocodile, but I think that the description in Job 41, which we'll get to later, rules that out. More likely, the Leviathan was an animal that we would classify as a dinosaur. And if that perks up your interest and your curiosity, there's plenty of stuff online talking about Leviathan, what this creature was. It's hard to lock it down with exact specificity, but there's all kinds of theories about which creatures we found fossilized that may match up with this, and that's an interesting study, but unfortunately, this is not a Leviathan study. So as we get into Job 3 through 37, I have to let you know that the language of these chapters is quite a bit different than the language of the first two chapters, which are kind of the historical narrative telling us what happened to Job. In chapters 3 through 37, Job and his friends are having discussions, and they use a lot of poetic language, a lot of metaphors, a lot of word pictures to discuss their points and to make the points that they want to make to one another. And so I will say that this language can be somewhat challenging. If you've read this chapter or read through some of the chapters that are to come, you'll recognize that. And so I'm not going to have time in a study like this to go over the interpretations of every one of those word pictures or metaphors, or to dive into what exactly Job is getting at when he uses this particular imagery. And so I definitely do encourage you to spend some more time with the chapter, hopefully before you watch this video or after. That might be helpful to clarify things. And I will say, with Job, other commentaries, other people who have really done in-depth study in the text, they can give you some really helpful perspectives to make sense of some of these images that you may be struggling through. And I've had to use several commentators as I've been working through Job because some of the language really is quite challenging to understand exactly what Job and his friends are trying to say. Now, that said, I don't want to scare you away from the book. It's not like that at all. I think we're going to be able to make very good sense of kind of the high-level points that these guys are making as they're having their discussions, even if some of the finer details are a little more hazy. So let's go ahead now and get into our text. We've got 26 verses today. I'm going to cover them all in one section. Job curses the day of his birth is our title today. Job has been sitting in his misery, his suffering, his loss, his grief, his pain because of his physical ailment now for some time. And now he's finally going to open his mouth and speak. And this is after this suffering has been wearing on him. And we're going to see that in chapter 3. So in Job 3, Job mourns the day that he was born because of all the suffering that has befallen him. After sitting 7 days with his friends in misery, Job cursed the day that he was born. He cursed the joy that was associated with his conception and with his birth, saying that he wished it had just never happened. He asked God why he didn't just allow him to die at birth. At least then he could be at peace. In death, the weary find rest, the burdened find relief, but he's still suffering there in the land of the living, and he's wondering why, because he doesn't even know why all of this is happening. Job asks God why death is given to those who want to live, and then life is given to those who want to die. He says this in verse 20 and 22, quote, "Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it comes not, and dig for it more than for hidden treasure, who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they find the grave?" Job didn't understand his situation, and he was confused about why God kept him alive. If God was angry at him, why didn't he just kill him? So again, he doesn't know why this suffering has come upon him. He doesn't know that it's actually Satan's fault. It's not God's anger against him. So he's just wondering. He's confused. Lord, if you're mad at me, if you're going to allow this to happen to me, why don't you just finish me off if I've done something wrong? Job felt like the light of God was still with him. He says that in chapter 20 and 23, but he didn't know how to make sense of what was happening to him. So this is kind of where we kick off this dialogue between Job and his friends, and one of Job's friends, Eliphaz, is going to respond to this in chapter 4, and we'll move ahead in that discussion from here. Okay, so as we finish up today, let's talk about an application. It may seem strange to the reader, I know it seemed a little bit strange to me, that Job expressed such contentment in God and in God's will in chapter 2, but he seems overwhelmed by his trials in chapter 3, even wishing that he had never been born. But I think for anyone who has ever suffered for any period of time, doesn't even have to be that long, this is the reality of extended periods of suffering. Some days you wake up and you're at peace. You're at peace with God's will. You say, God's going to handle everything. God's going to take care of me. And then other days you wake up and it's hard to shake the struggle, the grief, the difficulty, and you groan under the weight of it all. Just as with Job, having some hard days, feeling the weight of pain and suffering doesn't mean that we've abandoned our faith in God. There is real pain, real grief, real sadness, real loneliness, real hardship, real disappointment that is part of this life. And I think we're supposed to feel that. But when we feel it, rather than letting it turn our heart away from God, let it turn your heart to God, because He's the only one who can fix these problems. He's the only one who can give us a home where these terrible things aren't a plague on us anymore. You see Satan, and what does Satan bring into the world in the beginning of Genesis? He tempts Adam and Eve, they sin, and all this suffering comes into the world because of it. Pain, loss, death. And what do we see in Job? The exact same thing. Now, there's going to be a period of time when God determines that Satan is done, that he's going to be taken away, that he's going to be punished, removed, and that these temptations, this suffering isn't going to exist anymore when God gives us a new home. God is the only one who can fix the problem. And so when we suffer, look at Satan and say, this is your fault. I'm going to keep my trust in God, because one day he's going to deal with you and he's going to deal with all this pain. So that's our study in Job chapter 3 today. Lord willing, we'll be back tomorrow for Job 4.